Headliners are exceptionally important in set 10 for climbing because you need to understand what the strongest headliners are at each different stage of the game so that you don't waste gold on weaker headliners that are not going to make your board very strong, and instead use your gold exclusively on stronger headliners that are more cost effective, that are going to help you get into the late game and build even stronger boards. So the way this video is sorted is first we're going to look at each headliner by cost. So we're going to look at the 1 cost, the 2 cost, the 3 cost, the 4 cost, and the 5 cost. And then we're going to go and look at by level. So on level 4 and 5, you can only find 1 and 2 cost headliners. And then I'm also going to sort it by what items you have slammed. So if you have AD items held, then these are the different headliners that you're looking for on level 4 and 5. If you have AP items held, then these are the different headliners you're looking for on level 4 and 5, and so on and so forth. So that's the way the video is going to get split up. You can use the timeline below in order to get to the section that you're most interested in. I expect this to be used more as a reference source, but if you want to watch the whole thing through, be my guest. I'd be very grateful for that. Before we get into this real quickly, I want to mention that you can sub to my YouTube channel here. You can join in membership for $5 a month. You can also sub on Twitch. Either way is completely acceptable, and you will gain access to my Discord where I share insights on different patches, including headliner tier list, before I upload them onto YouTube. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, make sure you check that out. Just a quick little sponsorship from myself. Now let's get into the headliner, starting off with the 1 cost. So in S tier, we have Cassante and Corki. Cassante is only S tier if you get Heartsteel Cassante because the strongest opener in the game right now is Heartsteel. If you can get Heartsteel in stage 2 and 3, even a little bit in stage 4, it can be quite strong. Now, if you have Sentinel Cassante, that goes down into A tier, still very strong, still very much you can pick it up, especially if you have either Yone or Set to still play Heartsteel with it. But it's just not quite S tier like Heartsteel Cassante is. Also in S tier, we have Corki. Now, it doesn't matter which version of Corki you get. In fact, let me just mention real quickly that most of the time when I put a unit in a tier, it's assuming it doesn't matter which of the 2 headliner effects you get or which of the traits that you get. I will mention specifically if one trait is more important than the other one. Now with Corki, this is the most cost-effective AD carry that exists in the game right now. In fact, it's just generally speaking the strongest 1 cost carry that exists. And because of that, you can actually hold on to Corki through stage 2 and 3 and make more gold than people that are investing in 2 cost and 3 cost headliners going into stage 3. So Corki, very strong. A lot of people are playing around it in high elo right now. Definitely something that's worth picking up most of the time if you have items for him. Now we go down into A tier. So in A tier, these are different headliners that you should consider picking up, again, if you have the items for them. So starting off with Kennen, just generically a strong tank, and can also hold some carry items in the early game. If you have true damage active, if you have a super fan active, believe it or not, Kennen can do quite a bit of damage, still very strong. Annie is a little bit more specific. You need to have good AP items to go with the Annie. However, if you do, she can be quite strong, even if you don't play her as reroll. If you do play her as reroll, then you're definitely looking for Emo Annie more than Spellweaver because the composition fits a lot better with Emo than it does with Spellweaver. Then we have the 2 melee carries here, Olaf and Yasuo. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later on, but both are quite strong in stage 2, and even if you go into stage 3, if you have them fully itemized, they usually will not fall off until around 3-5. So these are pretty decent melee carries and can definitely get you through stage 2 reasonably. Now, when we get into B tier here, this is really most of the time you're going to skip these headliners. You're not actually going to pick them up. In some cases, you'll pick them up if your other units synergize well with them, but they're situational. So Lilia is a super fan. If you have good super fans, then you can play around Lilia. Jinx, again, also a rapid fire unit. If you have Aphelios or Senna, you could consider picking up Jinx. Even if it's just rapid fire Jinx by herself and you have some AD items, you can consider picking her up, especially if you have upgraded frontline. Evelynn, in my experience, is just a weaker melee carry. Tom Kench, generally situational. Most of the time, I don't find myself picking up Tom Kench unless I desperately need frontline. That means I have a backline that's upgraded, or if I have country units to pair with him. When it comes to Taric and Nami, they sort of fit the same category, which is if you have the other one upgraded. So if you have Taric with a Nami 2 on your bench, then you should pick up the Taric. If you have a Taric 2, then you should pick up Nami, especially if it's Disco, and either one of these, then the Disco opener is quite strong and it gives you very good direction going into Twisted Fate. And then Vi here, pretty much the only time I've ever picked up Vi is when my first orb has both a set and an Urgot, and it's Mosh or Vi. So generally speaking here, I have pretty much never picked up Vi, but there are circumstances where if you have an upgraded backline and you just need an upgraded frontline unit, you might want to consider picking up the Vi. And that's basically it for the 1 cost. Moving into the 2 cost, this is where the least balance exists, and it's mostly because of Senna. Senna is by far the strongest 2 cost headliner. It is pretty much, if you want to win streak in stage 3, you have to be playing Senna, or you have to have some pretty strong board to contest the other Senna boards. So Senna by far the strongest 2 cost. It's not even close. In A tier here, we have Aphelios. The main reason Aphelios exists in A tier is not because the unit itself is very strong as a headliner, but again, because Heartsteel is such a strong opener. So I want to mention here that when I put Aphelios in A tier, it's not because he's a super strong AD carry, it's just because Heartsteel is such a good opener in the early game here. If you don't play Aphelios with Heartsteel, then he's probably like low A tier, high B tier. It's just a regular old AD carry. Now in B tier here, this is mostly just because these things are so much better than everything else. B tier is not the same here as it is here, where when you're looking at B tier, it's mostly just because these are situational and there's so many better options. Here, these B tier options are just to show the power gap between these choices and Senna. Now, of course, you can play Garen with Senna 2 in your backline, and that's perfectly acceptable. But for the most part here, just trying to show the power disparity. Jax is pretty good if you have, let's say, a Hodge or a JG. If you have some sort of healing item, if you have Titans, if you have melee items in general, Jax can be quite good, especially if you're angling reroll. Same thing with Gnar. If you have some melee items, he can be quite strong in stage 2 and 3. Falls off pretty hard after like 3-5 or so, but pretty good up until then. Kai'Sa, the main reason she's down here in B tier is she's actually not that bad of a unit, but she's basically a more expensive Corki. And what I mean by this is that she's not enough stronger than Corki that it's worth investing an additional 3 gold. If that's going to cost you a gold interval, then she's probably not worth it most of the time over just playing Corki instead. So she's sort of a B tier unit, but you can still play around her as an AD carry. Katarina has fallen off quite a bit in terms of popularity, but still a reasonable AP carry if you're able to play around crowd divers with her. Garen, very strong frontliner if you need a frontliner. And then Bard, he might be more of a C tier unit. I have played around him a couple of times, especially when I had the Disco Dazzler shell. And if you have mana gen items for the Bard, and maybe like 1 AP item, he's pretty good. But you need to have those items for him to even do anything, and you need really good frontline for Bard to work. Basically, what I'm trying to say is you need to high roll for Bard to work. Now, in C tier here, these are units, generally speaking, you're not going to want to pick up. You might want to pick up Pantheon or Gragas if you have upgraded backline and you just need some frontline. Other than that, most of the time I find myself skipping these. Same thing with Kayle and Seraphine. These are just weaker AP carries. And then Twitch, I do not like this unit at all. I think it's a waste of gold, but that's my personal assessment. Now we move into the 3 costs, which tell a completely different story from the 2 cost, where there's a lot more balance here. We're not seeing that power imbalance where Senna's better than everything else. We really just have most units in A tier, so let's focus on this S tier and B tier. Now, the reason Amumu is in S tier is because he is so much tankier than every other tank that you can get in the 3 cost category. And if you have Headliner Amumu in stage 3 with at least 2 tank items, he's unkillable. He's completely unkillable. If you're fighting against any front-to-back composition, they're not going to be able to kill the Amumu in stage 3. When you go into stage 4, he's still very unkillable for most carries that are not 4 costs with 3 items. So if you're, again, fighting any front-to-back composition, if you have 3 items on a Headliner Amumu, he's not going to die very easily. If you have any upgraded backline, he will carry you and you will win the fight. So Headliner Amumu, very strong. He does fall off around 4-2 like most 3 costs do. So that's the only thing that's really working against 3 costs in general. But as a 3 cost tank, he is by far the strongest. Now everything else here in A tier is viable. So if you have items for any of these units, so for example, if you have tank items, Echo is good, Mordekaiser is good, Set is good, especially if you're playing around Heartsteel, Set can be very strong. If you have any melee items, then Yone is good, Urgot is good. So you have a lot of choices here when it comes to what you're playing around in A tier. Now I'll go a little bit more into detail here about this when we get into the different types of carries that you can play at different levels. But for now, I just want to mention that most 3 costs are viable. Now, when we get into B tier here, it's not that these are like way weaker than these A tier units. They just are, I think, a noticeable step down. For example, Nico, I think, is just a worse tank than Echo, Mordekaiser, and Set. And Riven is just a worse melee carry than Yone and Urgot. So as a headliner, she's generally just going to be worse. Other than that, not a lot to note here about the 3 cost other than you have a lot of options here. Now we move into the 4 cost. So in S tier, we have Akali. I've just included both versions of her. I will note that true damage Akali is much better than KDA Akali. This true damage unit, if you're playing around true damage as a vertical, is unbelievably strong. I would argue the strongest melee carry in the game right now. So yeah, true damage Akali, very, very strong. You might be surprised to see Poppy in S tier here, but this is by far the strongest tank in the 4 cost category if you're going to get her as a headliner. She does a lot of damage. She's very tanky, and she just, generally speaking, is a very good unit that fits into most boards if you get her as a headliner. Now, the one thing I will note is that she doesn't really fit into most compositions, meaning that if you're looking at meta TFT or if you're looking at tactics.tools, you're not going to find Poppy as part of most of the level 8 and level 9 boards. But do not skip this headliner on stage 4. If you find a Poppy in stage 4 as your headliner, she's almost always good enough to pick up. If you have any tank items to put onto her, or even melee carry items will work as well. So I think she deserves her spot in S tier. Then we have A tier here. So this is most of the different 4 costs. You have your AP carries in here with Ahri and Twisted Fate. You have a bunch of melee carries in here with Zed and Viego. You have your AD carries in here with your Ezreal and Caitlyn. And then you have Disco Blitzcrank or Sentinel Blitzcrank. Both are very strong in either playing with Ahri or Twisted Fate. Now in B tier here, we have Karthus. Now why is Karthus in B tier? It's because the compositions that you play Karthus in, it's just better to have Viego or Akali most of the time. Why is Thresh and Zac in B tier? It's because generally speaking, these other headliners are going to be more impactful on your board. Now, if you need a frontliner tank, then you can definitely pick up Thresh and you can definitely pick up Zac. But if you don't have upgraded backline, or if you do have some other upgraded frontline, for example, some 3 cost upgraded frontline, it's more beneficial for you to look for these 4 cost carries than it is to look for these tanks. Finally, we get to the 5 cost. So when we talk about the 5 cost here in S tier, we have Yorick, Qiyana, and Jhin. Yorick and Qiyana should come as no surprise. These were both very strong headliners in the last patch as well. Any melee items on these units are quite strong, but you might be surprised to see Jhin in S tier. Now, most people in the higher elo, high profile streamer space have mentioned that Jhin kind of feels like a weak unit at times because it takes a long time for him to get going. But if you get him as a headliner, and if you're playing this patch the way you're supposed to play it, which is you are heavily prioritizing blue buff plus IE, because those 2 items are really strong right now. If you're able to get those items on headliner Jhin, you win the game. Now, blue buff in particular is very impactful, and it's good on every single carry in the game right now, almost every single carry. I would say 75-80% of carries can use blue buff. So if you have a blue buff on headliner Jhin, trust me when I say it belongs in S tier, and I don't think that that is such a hard condition to meet because you should be heavily prioritizing blue buff in this meta right now. So I believe that Jhin deserves his spot in S tier. If you have any frontline at all that's upgraded with some tank items, you should do fine with Jhin. In fact, I think he's probably the strongest carry in the game right now. In A tier, we have Lucian and Alawi. The reason Lucian is here is because a lot of people are playing around Caitlyn. She's just a very strong AD carry. And if you're able to get a Lucian headliner, very good transition from Caitlyn, or you just play it with the Caitlyn as yet another AD carry. He's pretty strong, especially if you're able to hit the Jazz headliner. Now, Alawi is the strongest frontline in the game. It's not even close. So if you have some upgraded backline units and you just need stall for those units, then Alawi is by far the best unit for doing that. Lastly, we get into the B tier for the 5 cost. Now, I want to mention before we talk about each one of these individually is that B tier for 5 cost, of course, is like A tier or S tier when compared to any other unit in the game. But among the 5 costs, I believe these belong a category below these other ones. And we'll go into why for each one of these, starting off with Kayn. So Kayn, I have found sometimes is just generally an underwhelming carry, but especially if you don't have the best items for him. So if you're not talking like JG Hodge, or if you don't have BT Titans, just general AP items for him, or GS Guard Breaker, things that help him get through the front line, then you're going to find that this Kayn unit is very underwhelming. He's somewhat item dependent and also just generally not that strong, even when he has relatively acceptable items. So in my opinion, he belongs here in B tier. Then we get into Sona. So the problem with Sona, this might be a surprise because obviously Sona is still the strongest cap in the game. If you have a Sona 2 on your board with Rageblade, Shojin, whatever, it's going to be very strong. The problem is, number one, they nerfed the Sona unit in patch 13.25. Specifically, they nerfed attack speed Sona, which you're still playing around. But more importantly, Rageblade is one of the worst items in the game. So you're not slamming Rageblade most of the time in the early game. The only unit that Rageblade is really noticeably good on is Misfortune and Sona. So you're not going to slam Rageblade in the early game, so you have to find these Rageblades for Sona from stage 5 onward, which you're not going to be able to get the best in slot build for Sona, which is Shojin, Rageblade, or Rageblade, Shojin, because on top of Rageblade not being that good, Shojin's not that good anymore. I want to mention that the big issue with Sona is not the unit itself, it's the fact that you're rarely going to have the items for her, because you're not supposed to be slamming these items in the early game. Then we get to Ziggs. The main issue with Ziggs is it takes too long for him to ramp up. The other 5 costs are just better here. For example, Jhin is just a better version of Ziggs because he actually ramps up much more quickly, and once he's finally ramped up, he does more damage than any other unit in the game. Whereas Ziggs kind of just tickles everybody because he doesn't scale quickly enough after they made the nerf to the amount of bombs that he gains for each cast. So I believe that Ziggs belongs here in B tier, generally been somewhat underwhelmed with Ziggs. Now we move into the level portion of the headliner tier list. This should help you identify at each stage of the game what carries are you looking for with the items that you have slammed. So if you have AD items slammed and you're level 4 or 5, what headliner should you be looking for? If you have AP items slammed on level 4 and 5, what headliner should you be looking for? And then lastly, if you have melee items slammed, what headliner should you be looking for? We're not going to look at tanks because tanks are a little bit more generic and you can sort of take whatever frontline works with the units that you currently have on your board, but carries are a little bit more specific here. So let's go into detail for each one of these. Starting off with level 4 and 5, this is your 1 cost and your 2 cost headliners. So in the AD category, we have Corki and S tier. Why is Corki and S tier over Aphelios and Kai'Sa, even though these are 2 cost? It's because Corki is a lot more cost effective. So in the stage that you're playing him, which is stage 2 and stage 3, generally speaking, Corki is going to help you save gold, and he's not enough weaker than these 2 units. In fact, I would argue in a lot of cases he's stronger than these 2 units, surprisingly, that it's just better to play Corki. You're not going to transition off of this Corki unit. Obviously, you're not going to have Kai'Sa or Aphelios in stage 2 most of your games anyway, whereas it's a lot more reliable to find Corki in stage 2. So usually if you pick up a Corki, you're going to stick with Corki all the way until stage 4 in a lot of cases. He's just that strong of a unit. So Aphelios and Kai'Sa, they also fill in that generic AD role. The one thing I will note about Aphelios that makes him very strong is that he works with Heartsteel, and Heartsteel is the strongest opener in the game right now. So if you can play around Heartsteel, you should play around Heartsteel. Then we move down into Jinx. Jinx is really just a filler unit until you're able to find a better AD carry. And then Twitch, the reason I have him down in C tier, even though he's probably better than Jinx, is because he's just too expensive. So generally speaking here, I have found that you do not want to play around Twitch. And if you're going to play around Jinx, this is like early stage 2 only. And you want to move off of Jinx ASAP. So you're really not going to play this unit beyond stage 2-5 if you can help it. Now we move into AP carries. So Senna, far and above everything else, it's not even close here. If you have a Senna and you have AP items, you're probably going to be able to streak and only lose to other Senna players in stage 3. It just is how it is. The game's not balanced right now. Senna is way stronger than everything else. Now, when we go into A tier here with Annie and Katarina, these are a lot more specific. You need to have very specific items to make these work, and you need to have specific boards to make these work. So with Annie, you're looking for playing around Superfans, or you're looking to play around Guardians with a Mumu. And when it comes to Katarina, you're looking to play around either Country, or better yet, play around for Crowd Diver. Everything in B tier here, these are just units that if you have to play around them, you will, but most of the time you don't want to. In fact, it would probably be better to just lose streak than it is to pick up a lot of these different units and play AP items on them. Unless they really fit your board exceptionally well and you have a lot of upgrades, then you can consider picking these up and trying to play for win streak. The one thing I will note is that Nami is very decent if you have a good Disco Dazzler board. That means you have Tarek 2 and maybe Gragas 2. And same thing with Bard. If you have a good Disco Dazzler board, you already have a Nami 2, you have a Tarek 2, maybe you have a Gragas 2, you add a chosen Bard to your board with some AP items, that can be very strong. In fact, it can actually win streak all of stage 3. Lastly, for level 4 and 5, we look at the different melee carries. So in S tier, we have Jax and Yasuo. Jax is very good because you can actually play him as reroll later on, and he will scale into the late game. Same thing with Yasuo here. You can actually play Yasuo as reroll, 3-star him, and if you have true damage spat, he can actually do some work if you're able to play vertical true damage in the late game and get some secondary carries, most notably either Akali or Senna, or ideally both of them. So Yasuo has some scalability here. He's also just generically a good melee item holder. I would say he's the best melee item holder in stage 2 and 3 most of the time. Now, when we go into A tier here, these are units that don't really scale into the late game. You can't play them all game, but you can play them in stage 2 and 3 pretty reasonably, that being Gnar and Olaf. So if you have any of these items that I have on the right side here, you slam them onto these headliners, they're going to do reasonably well. One thing I will note about Olaf in particular is that they buffed his headliner, and he is very strong in stage 2. If whatever you're fighting against isn't like a Corki with some items on it, if they don't have enough single target damage, this Olaf is basically unkillable. So it's a good way to win streak if you have some good melee items and you throw them onto an Olaf. That can be very strong. And then in stage 3, Olaf actually can carry all the way up until around 3-5. Once you get to 3-5, same thing with Gnar, people start getting enough single target damage that these melee carries really start to fall off. And then in C tier, we have Evelynn. The reason she's all the way down here is that I've really not seen many people play around her. She kind of feels like a waste of gold. She's just not strong enough in her current state. Maybe you can play her in 4 Crowd Diver if you have it really early. Like, for example, you get a Katarina plus Yone from Orb. Maybe you can play around a Crowd Diver Evelynn. But other than that, generally, I find her to be too weak to be played around. Now we move into level 6 and 7. So this is your 2 and 3 cost headliners. Starting off with the AD carries. So the reason I have Aphelios in S tier, I've mentioned this a lot of times throughout the course of this video, Heartsteel is very strong. If you can play around Heartsteel in the early game, then that's what you should do. In A tier, we have the Big Shots. That's because Big Shot, along with Rapid Fire, it's just the best AD backline that you can play around. And these are the best options in this level 6-7 category. The thing I will note about Miss Fortune is she's relatively expensive. And so if you don't have any attack speed items for this Miss Fortune, she will be noticeably not that strong. She can get stuck on a lot of front lines, and generally speaking, just will not scale well enough. It's just not that strong if you do not have any attack speed items. So no bow items on MF feels pretty bad. Kai'Sa is pretty cost effective when it comes to comparing against MF, and is a lot more flexible with the items that you put on her. She's just generally going to be a little bit more expensive than Corki, a little bit stronger than Corki, up to you in terms of whether or not that's worth it. She falls off really hard in stage 4, so you're not going to want to play Kai'Sa in stage 4 unless the rest of your board is exceptionally strong. Now, in B tier here, we have Samira, which might come as a surprise because Country Reroll is pretty good, and Samira is just generally a good unit. So why is Samira below Miss Fortune and Kai'Sa? It's because, unfortunately, number one, if you get Country Samira and you're not playing around Country and you just want a flexible AD carry, it's not that strong. If you get Executioner Samira, it can be reasonable, but I have noticed that this Samira unit without IE feels a lot weaker. So if you have IE for the Samira, she's going to be very strong, and you can play her as a flexible AD carry. If you have some of these other AD items, you can still play her as an AD carry, but it does feel noticeably worse. So that's why I have her in B tier. And then in D tier here, we have Twitch. Again, I think he's just a waste of gold. It is what it is. Now we move into the AP carries at level 6 and 7. Again, this is your 2 and 3 cost. Senna, again, far and away the strongest. Even when comparing to 3 cost, Senna is basically a 4 cost unit. you should see Senna as a 4-cost carry. That's how strong she is. She's basically performing 2 tiers above where she's at. She's that strong. So Senna, by far the strongest AP carry that you can play around. Then we have Lulu, Vex, and Katarina. Just generally, all of them are decent AP carries. Again, Katarina requires a little bit more setup, where you really do need to have crowd divers, or at the very least some country units to play with her, but ideally crowd divers, and you kind of need more specific AP items to make her work, but she is still pretty strong. And then Lulu, very flexible. She'll take almost anything you can give her. Same thing with Vex. So these are just good generic AP carries. They are on the more expensive side if you're in stage 3 though. So if you're playing around Vex and Lulu, honestly, for the amount of gold that you're investing, in my opinion, most of the time, they're not going to give you the return that you're looking for. That's why Senna's up here in S tier. And then in B tier here, these are a lot more situational. You're just looking to play around these if your board suits it. So like, for example, we know that Lux reroll is pretty good right now, but the thing is, Lux 2 is noticeably a lot worse than Lux 3. And when I say this, I mean, basically, there is almost like a threshold that before you meet it with Lux in terms of the amount of damage she does, she basically just tickles the backline and feeds the mana. So before you're able to just one-shot the backline, this Lux unit feels really bad. And I've already talked about Bard. Seraphine, again, you need very situational superfan KDA type opener. And then Kale, very situational as well, requires attack speed items, generally not that strong. Now we move into the melee carries. So Urgot, Yone in S tier, very strong. They fit into several different boards and are just generally good carries. So you can, if you have like Edge of Night, for example, on either of these units, very strong. Hodge on either of these units, very strong. Even BT is fine on both of these units. Any of these items that I'm showing on the right side here, very good on Urgot plus Yone. Jax, again, you could play him as a reroller. I think he's a little bit weaker than these as a flexible carry in the mid game. That means you're not playing him as a reroll, but still pretty decent. And then in B tier here, Gnar really falls off. In fact, you can almost argue Gnar is C tier. He falls off after 3-5 because he just dives in, and if they have any good single target damage, they're going to be able to kill the Gnar very quickly. And then Riven just doesn't do enough until she has pretty good setup with 8-bit and edgelords. And so if you're not committing to Riven as a flexible AD carry, she's usually not that good. So I have her in B tier here. Most of the time, you're not going to want to play around her. Now we move into level 8. So level 8 AD carries here. S tier, of course, we have our 4-cost with Ezreal and Caitlyn. Now I want to note, you don't have a lot of choices here. So you really just have the new 4-cost, which is Ezreal and Caitlyn, and then you have the 3-cost that we already talked about. Same thing as before with MF, you need attack speed items, and then with Samira, you really want crit items. And I think that Samira is noticeably weaker if you don't have those crit items. All right, so your 4-cost, both Ezreal and Caitlyn are very strong. If you have any of these items slammed onto them, they feel very good on level 8. Then we move into the AP carries here. With the AP carries, you're looking at Ahri and Twisted Fate as your S tier, especially if you're playing with Twisted Fate in particular. If you have that good Disco Dazzler board and can go level 9, very strong. With Ahri, if you're playing around either KDA or Sentinels, either one, very strong as well, so they belong in S tier. The reason Karthus is in A tier is that even though he belongs to a pretty strong comp with Akali, Karthus, Viego, it is better to just get those units as headliners, so generally speaking here, Karthus is on the weaker side. The other thing of note with Karthus is that he is a lot less flexible. So Ahri can go onto any board, even if you don't have KDA, even if you don't have Sentinels. As long as you have some frontline and you just enable the Ahri with good items, she's going to do damage, she's going to kill units. Same thing with Twisted Fate, sort of. I would say Twisted Fate is kind of conditional as well. So, but he's stronger with his conditions than Karthus is. So unlike Karthus, where you really don't want him as a headliner, you do want Twisted Fate as a headliner, hence why he's in S tier here. Ahri is the most flexible of the 3. And then, of course, all of the 3-costs are in B tier here. They're noticeably weaker than the 4-cost. And then finally, we move into the melee carries on level 8. So Akali, far and away the best melee carry that exists. It's just very strong, especially true damage Akali, just by far the strongest melee carry. Then we have Viego and Zed, very strong as well. You're not going to greed for Akali. I want to note that. If you're trying to play Akali in your comp, but you're able to find one of these first and you have these melee carry items, trust me, Viego and Zed are very strong. And then we have in the B tier and C tier, we just have our 3-cost melee carries that we've talked about before, Riven being a little bit weaker than Yone and Urgot. We move into, finally, the level 9 and level 10. So this is where you have your 5-cost and your 4-cost. So in S tier, of course, we have our 5 costs with Jhin and Lucian. I will note that I think Jhin is better than Lucian, but Lucian is more flexible than Jhin, and I have actually kind of gone up in my evaluation of Lucian because I actually think the unit is just pretty reasonable as a carry. He's just not a primary carry. You have to play him as a secondary carry, but if you're playing Lucian plus Caitlyn, they can snipe the backline pretty reasonably. Now, in A tier here, we have Ezreal. Why is Ezreal by himself in A tier and Caitlyn's not here as well? It's because Big Shot Ezreal allows you to play around the Jhin, Misfortune, Lucian, Ezreal backline, which is very strong. And so as a result of that, I actually think Big Shot Ezreal is one of the main headliners you're looking for on level 9 now that it's not as likely you're going to find those 5-cost headliners. And then Caitlyn, still very strong, by the way. When I put her in B tier here, I want to note she's still an endgame viable headliner if you have to play around her. I just think these other options might be a little bit stronger in most cases. And then we move into our AP carries here. I want to note that the AP headliners are definitely on the weaker side. So in specific, when we look at Ziggs here, I don't actually think that Ziggs belongs in S tier. I almost would argue nothing belongs in S tier here, because Ziggs just requires an unfathomable amount of frontline to work. I really feel like if you're going to go for headliner Ziggs, it's almost exclusively in the Disco Dazzler comp with all 5 costs, really strong upgraded frontline. Other than that, I found that he's really not that strong for the most part. He doesn't do enough damage. He doesn't scale quickly enough to be worth as a headliner compared to some of these other options, given their cost effectiveness. Now, you're still going to pick him up if you find him and you have AP items, but I don't know that he belongs in S tier. He's not like so much better than these other options that he deserves his own tier. I've already mentioned before with Sona that you need very specific items. So Sona is S tier if you have specifically Rageblade and Shojins to put onto her. The problem is in the majority of games, you're not going to have these items to put onto her because they're not items you want to slam in the early game anymore, like you did in the Fast 9 meta, where you could guarantee that you were going to get Sona every single game. So because Sona items are harder to get nowadays, I would say she's A tier because she's situational. But if you have Sona items, then she moves up into S tier. And then, of course, Ari and Twisted Fate, we just talked about that. And again, same thing here with Karthus, where he's in B tier because the comps that want him would just be better off with other headliners. And then finally, we move into our AD carries here. In S tier, of course, we have Yorick and Kiana. They are so far and above everything else that they belong in their own tier. And then in A tier, I have everything else. So it might come as a surprise when I said Akali was the best, that maybe Zed and Viego should be in B tier. But Akali and both versions of Akali are not better enough than Zed and Viego that I think they deserve their own tier. One thing I will note, though, is that you could argue this because once you get into stage 6, it does feel like Zed and Viego fall off a little bit unless you're playing 6 Crowd Diver with Zed, whereas Akali doesn't really feel like she falls off that hard in stage 6. So Akali is something you can end the game with, whereas Zed and Viego, if you can upgrade to one of these other melee carries, most of the time you're going to try to do it. So that's one thing I will note. Maybe these two belong in B tier here, but it's not a huge power gap. It's not like you should be open selling this and trying to roll for one of these because you're desperate to get stronger. It's not that much weaker that I believe they belong in their own category. And that's it for the headliners in patch 13.25. I hope this helped you with understanding how you should approach headliners. I hope this helped you understand what high elo players are focusing on. And I hope it helps you with your roll downs now that you know, based on the items that you have slammed, what you should be looking to roll for at different levels in the game. And this should hopefully help you be a little bit more flexible about what you play around. And the big thing of note here, the things that might come as a surprise, I want to go back real quickly here. Make sure that you're not passing up on this Papa unit. I think this Papa unit is extremely underrated by people that are in lower elo because it's not part of different compositions in meta TFT or tactics.tools. But trust me when I say she's the best frontliner that you can get for stage 4 and stage 5. She falls off pretty hard stage 5 and beyond. But before that point, very strong and should definitely be on your lookout for picking up. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you next time.